One of their other major tactics is just pressuring theaters to try to cancel the performance. And so
I'm just trying to think, imagine you're a theater owner and you get a letter from the Chinese consulate or embassy in your country or city. I mean, what are you thinking? It's just nuts, right?
Yeah, that's why they would often forward us the letters and say, what is this about? So for example, in Little Rock, in Arkansas, the theater manager received such a letter, and he was just outraged, and he reported this to the FBI and said, what is this? This is the United States of America. You're not going to tell me what can and cannot be performed on our stage.
What is Shenyun, and why does the Chinese Communist Party try so hard to stop its performances? How is this related to other attempts by the Chinese regime to influence American companies? And how is this all part of the Chinese Communist Party's broader effort to control the narrative about China abroad and suppress dissenting voices? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with Li-Shai Lemish, who has been an MC with Shenyun Performing Arts since its inception in late 2006.
Li-Shai Lemish, really wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you for having me.
So Li-Shai, Shenyun, over 1 million people, I think, have seen the show in 2019 globally, millions of Americans. I think there isn't anyone online that hasn't seen a Shenyun ad. I mean, they seem to come up often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, beautiful colors, beautiful traditional dance. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to suppress or perhaps even destroy this whole Shenyun phenomenon. What's going on?
So it's a little odd. You have a performance of traditional Chinese culture that Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party wants to stop. And it's a performing arts company that's based in New York. So here is a revival of traditional Chinese culture happening outside of China. And like you said, we performed in front of 1 million people last year. We've been performing for 13 years. And we perform all over the world, but not China.
Right.
So it's a celebration of Chinese culture that cannot be seen in China.
It's really interesting because, the other side of China, Taiwan, right, is free democratic society, and I've seen video of the Shenyun fans kind of running after the performers, huge presence there. So obviously Chinese are very interested and would like to see it.
Well, I love performing in Taiwan because Taiwan has really preserved a lot more of the traditional Chinese culture. Even the script that they use in Taiwan is a traditional script. You can pick up books from a couple thousand years ago and read them, the same characters that they use in Taiwan today, whereas in China they've simplified it. So I actually studied Chinese in Taiwan. And when we perform in Taiwan, usually it's like 6 weeks or something, we have just shows every single day, double shows sometimes. And a lot of the audience members are actually from China. So those who are in China who can afford to, they've heard about Shenyun, they can't wait to see it. We get emails on our website all the time from people in China saying, when are you coming to China? We can't wait to see you here in the mainland. But they can't right now, so they fly to Taiwan, they see us there.
Give me a sense of, what is Shenyun all about? Where did it come from? Why is it in New York of all places?
Shenyun is a performing arts company that is basically focused on reviving traditional Chinese culture. That's the mission, to revive 5,000 years of Chinese civilization.
Okay.
And the performance is classical Chinese dance is the main art form. So this is an art form that's like the Chinese equivalent of ballet. So ballet has a history of several hundred years, it's performed in the palaces of Louis XIV and so on in Europe and was systematized. Classical Chinese dance is very similar, but has a history of 5,000 years or even longer. And one dynasty after another was passed down. So some of the dances that you see in Shenyun were dances that had at one time been performed in front of the emperor in the royal palace by the court ladies or by generals coming off the battlefield. They would do some martial arts moves, and then over time it evolved into dance. So you have a bit of a similarity between Chinese martial arts and Chinese dance. They're kind of like brothers, twin brothers separated at birth, and one took a martial arts path and one took a performing arts path.
Okay.
And there's music, there's a live orchestra, there's beautiful costumes, and then really the core of the performance is bringing out the traditional Chinese values, virtues, ideas like loyalty and integrity and faith, which of course are not only Chinese, but have really been lost in terms of how the stories are portrayed today in China. They're just surface stories, but the actual core values behind them are lost. And Shenyun is bringing those back and performing them around the world. So it was established in New York because you couldn't do this in China. A group of Chinese artists, elite artists from around the world, we have some of our choreographers are from Australia, from China, from Taiwan, around the world, came together in New York with this shared mission of let's bring back this traditional Chinese culture and show the world what Chinese culture really is about. It actually started off as a Chinese New Year production.
Right.
Because the Chinese embassies and consulate, they would have these shows for the Chinese New Year, supposedly, which is in the winter. And they became just these big propaganda pieces for the communist regime. The whole show was quite literally very red. It was all about how great the Communist Party is, and there weren't these traditional stories. And people said, does not represent us, let's have our own show. And actually, NTD was the first one to put together a Chinese New Year gala here in New York, and then later on, it traveled a little bit around the country. And then over time, it became such in demand that Shen Yun said, let's create our own performing arts company, do this full time, and focus on classical Chinese dance. And that's how Shen Yun came to be. But from the very beginning, the Communist Party has tried to stop us.
Right. Well, and of course, at the Epoch Times and our sister media NTD, which you just mentioned, we've been very proud to be able to support, Shen Yun all these years, right? And, be at the performance, report on the performances and so forth.
Yeah, it's been great because we see the journalists sometimes in the lobby after a performance and they're talking to audience members, and you get to see how people are really moved by the performance, because I think the underlying message of the performance is that there's hope. That no matter how things get, how crazy things are in the world today, and they seem to be crazier every day sometimes, there's still hope. And the hope lies in rediscovering our roots, in finding what it is that we're here to do on this earth, and a spiritual connection. And people are touched by it, and they don't expect it. And beyond that, the performance is so positive. There's no use of dark colors and just morbid themes. It's very positive and uplifting, so people leave and they're in tears. And NTD and Epoch Times have been reporting on it. We see these audience members, they could be congressmen, they could be VIPs of various walks of life, and they're just unabashedly emotional talking about the performance. And that's been really inspiring because everybody works really, really hard. We have a new performance every year, so which is almost unheard of in the performing arts world. We just come back from 5-6 months on tour, and we have a little break, and we get ready for the next tour. And the dancers especially work extremely, extremely hard. And it's a very athletic dance form, so they're flipping and they're landing and they're just going in and out of different costumes, but then we do see the audience feedback.
You mentioned this spiritual dimension, and a number of the performers practice the Falun Gong spiritual discipline. There's a connection where some of our founders were Falun Gong practitioners 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. How does this spiritual dimension fit into the show?
Traditional Chinese culture is said to be divinely inspired. The idea is that this culture, this civilization, actually was brought down by heavenly beings and imparted to humankind. And over time, it was constantly enriched by this kind of semi-divine cultures. You have the idea of immortals walking around men and giving them everything from calligraphy and the written script to agriculture and medicine and even food and things like that.
And we see that in the stories that are shown.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I really love about Shen Yun, is these learning these true versions of the legends and the myths and the traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that theme of spirituality is woven through the entire performance, just like it was really through 5,000 years of civilization, at least until the previous century. And so, for example, you take a story like Journey to the West, the Monkey King and his fellow disciples, Pigsy the flying pig, and Sandy, and then the monk. This is based on a true story of a Tang Dynasty monk who walked from China to what is today known as India to bring back Buddhist scriptures to China and translate them. And there's this novel about his disciples / bodyguards who protect him. They have supernormal abilities, and they're doing all these things. They're fighting demons and goblins and foxes disguised as women and all this different things. And basically, you can take it as just a story. And I think a lot of the performances and TV shows, cartoons out of China, just about the Monkey King and his antics. But really, it's a metaphor for a spiritual path, because they go through different tribulations. There's tribulations involving fame and desires and perseverance. And one pass at a time, they have to make it all the way to the end where they reach their spiritual perfection. And so these stories, and it's the same for the other classic novels and other heroes that are portrayed on stage, they really have an underlying spiritual theme, and that is a big part of what we do at Shen Yun, is bring that out.
You yourself are an MC for the show, and there's this kind of unique element actually to the show, which I think is a lot of people that have seen the show, you know, I've gone a number of times, I've taken friends and so forth, and they really love this, what you actually do.
Okay, it's good to hear.
Which is kind of help people understand, right?
Yeah. So we just go on stage very briefly between the pieces. So the performance is not one narrative theme. You do have this underlying theme of reviving civilization and the spiritual elements of it, but it really is about 20 little vignettes. You might be traveling from the heavens to an imperial palace, and you're on a battlefield, and you're in a specific region of China, different stories and different legends. And a big part of what we do as MCs is we introduce the piece. So no matter how much or how little you know about Chinese culture, you can understand and follow the story. So we've had anybody from people who've never been to China, never read a Chinese novel, they can really follow all the stories because the art form, dance, really does most of the storytelling. We just tell you what dynasty it is and what the background is. You can just jump right in. It's really about 5 minutes or so for a story, so you have to get a lot in, and if you spend the time trying to figure it out, it's a little difficult. So we just go on, say a few sentences, and get out of the way.
And you know, one of the things that I've heard you say in the show, I think perhaps even last year, I think you were the MC in the show that I saw, you talk about how the show can't be seen in China, right? And there's this, the Chinese Communist Party is you know, very opposed. We've had, I mean, I've seen letters in the past from Chinese officials to theater owners saying, don't put this show on. I mean, crazy stuff, right? Like serious pressure when you have the PRC. Where does this come from?
Yeah, well, it comes directly from top leaders in the Chinese Communist Party. Perhaps even leaders of the previous regime who were so adamant about banning Falun Gong and stopping anything that Falun Gong practitioners do. And so when Falun Gong practitioners came along and said, we're going to have this performance and we're going to revive traditional Chinese culture, and we might even show pieces about the persecution of Falun Gong and the courage of people who practice Falun Gong to stand up for their beliefs and still find a sense of hope, they were really afraid. So from the very first year that we started touring, this was end of 2006, 2007, we noticed this phenomenon. Wherever we would go, there would be this kind of force following us around. At first what they did is they would send performing arts companies of their own to try to compete with us. So there would be Shenyun on one side of the street, and then in a theater opposite it, there would be some performance out of China. Sometimes it would be just blatantly Maoist kind of ballet in Red Guard attire and the whole thing. Other times it would be a disguise for traditional Chinese culture. And I remember sometimes we'd show up somewhere and people would say, oh, we already saw your performance. We said, that's impossible. We just arrived in Netherlands today. What are you talking about? No, last week, totally saw it. And then we look it up, and they're basically trying to fight for the audience members. But that didn't work out so well for them, especially maybe in the beginning. People didn't know what Shenyun was. It was our first year on tour, so people are a little confused. Over time, our brand is pretty strong now. People know what to expect, and they had a really hard time selling tickets. They would give away tickets and put people there. And they sent out like 60 companies the first year to try to do this. And in The Hague, at one point in Europe, we actually had to reschedule our performance. And they moved their performance to the new date as well, like I said, across the street. So that was something they did early on. One of their other major tactics is just pressuring theaters to try to cancel the performance. And so
I'm just trying to think, imagine you're a theater owner and you get a letter from the Chinese consulate or embassy in your country or city. I mean, what are you thinking? It's just nuts, right?
Yeah, that's why they would often forward us the letters and say, what is this about? So for example, in Little Rock, in Arkansas, the theater manager received such a letter, and he was just outraged, and he reported this to the FBI and said, what is this? This is the United States of America. You're not going to tell me what can and cannot be performed on our stage. And really, this has very little traction in the US, but I think pretty much every theater we've gone to, the theater manager, the directors, they've gotten letters. Sometimes we go to the theater and they'll tell us in person. Other times we get there, especially early on, before people really knew us. Now we go to the same theaters every year. They all know us. And also the theater heads, the directors, they talk to each other. They all know what the deal is. But early on, we'd show up to the theater and there's kind of a bit of a cold reception and we don't know what's going on. And then they see the show and they get to know us after a couple of days. They tell us, you know, initially this was my impression because we got the visit from the Chinese consulate and they were saying you guys are nuts and you guys are some kind of cult and we should be afraid of you and not let you perform and this is going to be bad. And often they'll get threats that if you allow Shenyun to perform, then we will not allow you to have any companies from China perform at your theater. You will personally not get a visa. So for example, in Berlin, we were going to perform in Berlin a couple years ago, and the theater manager there received a visit from the embassy, and they told him exactly this: if you allow Shenyun to perform, you will not have any Chinese companies perform at your theater, and you will also not get a visa. But this guy was from East Germany. He knew to deal with communism. He actually experienced some persecution himself, and so he just kicked them out and said, you know what, we're not listening to you. This is Germany, or this happens all across the world. So in the United States, people tend to just respond and get out of here. This is the U.S. But in some places, Eastern Europe especially, former Soviet bloc countries, Moldova, Romania, Ukraine, certainly Russia, these kinds of places, as well as some places in East Asia that are close to China, where they feel like they're a little fish in a big pond and China's a big shark. Places like South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, they're still very susceptible to this kind of pressure, and we've had performances canceled even last minute. In Moldova, for example, we were traveling 3 days straight from Turkey by bus to Moldova, and we had to go through customs and I'll clear all the visa issues that we had, and it's a holiday, and then the roads in Romania are really bad, just one pothole after another. We finally arrived in Moldova, which is not a very big country. It's not a huge economic superpower in Eastern Europe. It's one of the poorest countries in Eastern Europe. This is in 2010. And we show up at the theater at 7 o'clock in the morning, having just arrived at the hotel around 2 a.m. So 7 o'clock we show up to set up for the performance that night. And the security guard says, you can't come in, the show has been canceled. We say, what are you talking about? The tickets are sold. He said, no. And the theater manager shows up and she says, no, it's canceled. And she wouldn't say why. She got in her car, slammed the door, and drove off, almost hitting one of our performers. And then we're just kind of standing around, and then the media started showing up, the Moldova media there in Chisinau. And then they're just reporting this, and we started hearing murmurs that this was pressure from the Chinese embassy. And then later that afternoon, we're sitting at a coffee shop, and somebody from City Hall came and found us. There's a couple of Chinese people and myself in this coffee shop in Moldova, and there's not another Chinese person in sight, unless they're from the embassy. And so she says, let me tell you what actually happened. And she said, we got visits regularly on a daily basis from the Chinese embassy. And they also sent people from the foreign ministry. So the Chinese embassy would find the Moldovan foreign ministry and have them do the bidding for them. And they would go to the theater. And this executive from City Hall told the theater manager, do not cancel the performance. You have no legal backing. You have a contract. This is not good for you long term. And she just felt at the end of the day, the theater manager, that she had no choice and she canceled the performance under all this pressure. And that started a lawsuit. And behind the scenes, we found out later there was a Reuters article saying that Moldova had been promised 1 billion euros from China the previous April.
So this was what was kind of hanging in the balance.
That was probably the carrot. Yeah. Of course, they never got the money. They canceled the show and still never got the money. And you'd say, why would China care about Moldova? But this is maybe what they were trying to do. And of course, I'm not saying Shenyun is the only place where this happens, because we know that they do this kind of thing with book exhibits, with Dalai Lama speeches, any Falun Gong activity whatsoever. They always try to stop it. But Shenyun, having traveled around the world, I've seen this happen everywhere. So about year 2 or 3, I started noticing this, and I started documenting it. And I have a website where I list all the cases.
Right, that's right.
It's like 70 something, and I don't even update it all that often. Maybe a couple times a year I'll go and update it. And these are just the cases that I know and can document. There are cases that I've been told about that they said you can't disclose this. Okay, we don't get ourselves in trouble, but here's what happened. I get the whole backstory. But the ones that I can, I'll put up there. And it evolved later on from the theater manager pressure to writing letters to congressmen, senators, supervisors of town councils saying do not see the performance. And so
yeah, that's kind of bizarre. I mean, I've of course read about that as well. They just say, hey, listen, don't go see this.
Don't go see this.
What a weird, like, you know, I think any American, if they get a letter like that, will be like, I definitely need to go see this.
Well,
right?
I never heard of this. I got to go check it out. That's totally what happened. In Canberra, we were performing this, the capital of Australia. First year on tour is when this happened. And we finished the performance, and we're walking off stage, and through the front door, and I'm walking with my MC partner. We're walking back to the hotel, which is very close. And there's a couple of parliament members standing there, and we didn't know who they were. They said, hey, we'd just like to introduce ourselves. We are parliament members who came to see the show. We really loved it. So, oh, that's great. How did you find out? They said, well, we got a letter from the Chinese embassy saying, don't come see this show. So of course, like, well, we got to check it out. And they said there were so many people, so many parliament members there. They could have had their parliamentary meeting right there during intermission if they wanted to. Just all these people, they all loved it. And so actually, in a way, it's a bit of free advertising for us. Right. It does cause some headaches, but it's basically free advertising.
You know, it's very interesting because in the last few years, I think maybe the last 5, but not much longer than that, we've become aware collectively as North Americans, as in Canada and in the U.S. and I think increasingly in Europe, that there is this kind of interference from the Communist Party of China, not just on Shenyun, but in all spheres almost of life, whether it's in politics, whether it's in hedge funds where economic indices are pressured. There's all sorts of places where this is happening. So kind of I kind of think like Shenyun was kind of a canary in the coal mine. There weren't when you started this blog, there weren't as many people listening. Right. But I think these days, a lot of people are like, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
Given all the other craziness that's been happening.
And it's so systematic. The thing is, you have to really be very discerning. And if people are, like you're saying, are more and more aware of it, then maybe they're more skeptical and they more critically look at these phenomena and say, okay, what's actually behind it? So for example, a few years ago, 2017, they ran an ad which was actually in the form of an article written by the China Daily. So China Daily is the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes,
but
and they have inserts in English in major U.S.
So this
media.
Is what this was. They had an insert, and it said something like, the title was just straight out of the Chinese Embassy's website or something like, Shenyun is a blasphemy to performing arts or something like that. And it was published in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, the London Telegraph, anywhere from Melbourne, Australia to Nashville, Tennessee, all over the place, same time. And it was disguised as a regular article. So if you're just reading, oh, here's an article about Chinese culture and Shenyun, oh, interesting, the Washington Post doesn't think it's a good show. But this is actually just something straight out of the Politburo from Beijing. So you really have to be, but if you're looking carefully and you're really well educated and attuned to this, you'll see right away, okay, I see the terms that they're using, I see the format, oh, it says paid ad at the very bottom and upside down fine print.
Yeah, exactly, you can't barely see it.
And there's stuff we can't really prove as well. We don't really know the extent of all of this, but we know that we're being followed. We know that our emails have been hacked. We know that our website was hacked from China, and this was reported to the FBI and the US government at the very first week of ticket sales and was shut down. And we have all this as evidence, but there's stuff that we can't really prove. Like, for example, when you go on Google, where are all these thousands of positive reviews about Shenyun? At the very top, you have a few negative articles. Very few have been negative, but they put them right there at the top. And there's like very small publications that are somehow at the top. The Chinese Embassy is very close to the top as well. These are not, high traffic websites, but they're at the top there. And then if you go to Yahoo, you go to Bing, you get very different search results. So what is it about Google, and did somebody figure out an algorithm, and did the 50 Cent Army that does all this stuff? I mean, it's very suspicious to me.
So just for the 50 Cent Army, for the benefit of our viewers, give me a thumbnail of what the 50 Cent Army. I expect some of our viewers know, but.
Well, they actually have some new names now, so this might be a bit of an antiquated name, but it started off, I think, at least 10 years ago, probably earlier than that. And these were people posting comments on articles that the Chinese Communist Party did not like. They were basically repeating the party line.
Paid trolls, basically.
And then the 50 cents is reportedly how much they were paid. This is 50 cents Chinese, so it's, a few cents in US dollars back in the day. I don't think they're paid that way anymore. In fact, it seems like the people working on this now are more and more actually full-time hired by the Chinese Communist Party to do this. These are not just random people getting 50 cents. And according to a study, I believe it was in Harvard, there's close to 500 million posts a year that they've done. Now, that's just commenting on an article to maybe make it go up in the ranking, or to just kind of present the party line on something that the Communist Party doesn't like. But I believe that there's other methods involved, kind of black hat, inbound links and things like that. Yeah, that where you can move articles up to the top of the page. And there's, for example, Wikipedia, we see this all the time. Whenever something is positive about Shenyun, there's going to be a bunch of people trying to put all this random stuff at the top that's unsubstantiated, and the Wikipedia editors and different people get in there and they have this fight over it. And then you see it's constantly changing. And so if people haven't seen the show, and like you said, we performed in front of millions, but that's still just a drop in the bucket. They go to Google and, oh, what is Shenyun? Oh, here's really the party line being represented in maybe mainstream media, and who knows how those articles got written in the first place. Were people behind the scenes encouraging a certain perspective? That's stuff that at this point is still a question, but it to me is very suspicious. And I clearly remember this one article in London. This was 2008. We're performing in London, Royal Festival Hall, and it was a great show. They were just loving the performance. We had multiple curtain calls. We had some jokes, especially for the London audience, that people really, really loved, and just they could not get enough of it. And then an article comes out in the Telegraph and it says, oh, this performance was terrible. The dance wasn't exciting. The jokes were stupid. The singers were really bad. I'm like, were we watching the same performance? I was on stage. I know like what the audience was responding. And you know, at the very least, if you personally did not like it, this does not represent the audience. And that article for years was at the very top, above the fold on Google. So people would get the impression this is what the performance is about.
You know, actually, one thing I do want to cover a little bit is kind of the scale of the show, because you started, I can't, maybe you can tell me.
2006 with one company.
2006 with one company. Yeah. You know, you're able to reach 1 million people a year because you have how many?
So year one, we had one group.
Yeah.
Then year two, we had two groups. Each group is like 70, 80 people. And you
between the orchestra and the dancers.
Right, so you have a full orchestra troupe, you have a full dance troupe, you have technical crew, you have soloists, singers, MCs, and you have company management. So you have about 70, 80, sometimes even 90 people in a company. We went year one group, year two, year two, three. Then we stayed at 3 for a few years, and we went to 4, 5, 6, and then this year we're going to 7. This will be the first time we have 7. We've grown by one company every year lately. And we also have a symphony orchestra that's a combination of kind of like Transformers, powers combined. The different orchestras come together and they put together a symphony orchestra that performs at Carnegie Hall and around the world. Yeah, yeah. So that has allowed us to reach more people. So one company typically performs about 100 shows in about 30 cities in over 5 months. So it's pretty intense. We don't really stay anywhere for too long. We might be there at most, like Lincoln Center, we might be there for 3 weeks. But that's really an exception. A lot of places we're there for a week if it's a big city, or 2 weeks maybe, like a Tokyo. But generally the smaller cities, this might be the biggest city in the state, we'll be there for maybe 3 days, maybe the weekend, and then we go to next city. So we're pretty quick. And so now with 7 groups, we have over 700, maybe close to 800 performances. It's
mind-boggling even to think of the idea that you're traveling with 90 people, you know,
you have to really get along,
so forth. Yeah,
because you have the same roommate and the same bus seat mate. But I think a lot of what helps us get along is this kind of spiritual grounding. We meditate together, we study together, we try to follow the principles of the teachings of Falun Dafa, which include taking responsibility and ownership when something goes wrong and looking where you could have done better. And that, I'm not saying we can do it 100% of the time, but that's what we strive to do. And that really dissolves a lot of the friction you might have 6 months being with the same roommate.
Something that always struck me as very interesting, I think I kind of learned this a bit from watching Shen Yun over the years. In traditional Chinese culture, there's this, well, let's say the spiritual element was integrated into all aspects of life. Right. Like you see it, I remember this one episode where the students are learning, I think, calligraphy, and then, but in order to learn calligraphy, they also have to learn how to meditate, because how could you do calligraphy without having a clear mind? But that's I don't know if we really think like that these days. That's a very, very interesting aspect to me.
Yeah, I think there's a sense of a purity of intent to what you're doing, and then this idea also that to create really true art that's got depth to it, that is worthy of the divine even, you have to first foster your own inner virtue and purity. And so an artist would actually meditate before working on a statue or a painting. And the whole idea was to have art that uplifts people. And that's what we're doing with Shen Yun as well. So you look at it like if you're going to Versailles, say, and you're looking at some of the frescoes and the paintings there, and you really get inspired. These are heavenly scenes. And that's the idea, is that you create something that will be left for generations, and people will look at and think, okay, there's really so much human potential, and what are we really here to do? And what is our connection to what's beyond this life that's in front of us? And I think that's what artists would strive to, and that requires constant self-refinement and constant sense of elevating your moral grounding.
So Li Shai, how did you get involved in all of this?
Through baseball, of course.
What?
So I was a very committed baseball player. Didn't quite have the talent to make it all the way, but that's what I wanted to do, be a professional baseball player. And through high school, and then later on, as I evolved in my training, advanced in it, I realized that we get trained physically a lot, pitching mechanics and physical conditioning. But when you talk to or read what the top athletes have to say, your Michael Jordans, Tiger Woods in any sport, they say it's 90% mental, right? As Yogi Berra said, it's 90% mental, the other half is physical or something like that. So, but nobody trains that. And so I really got into meditation and guided imagery, and I got to the point that I could kind of almost predict what would happen in a game. I would meditate before the game. I would run this kind of movie reel in my mind of what would happen in the game, bases loaded, 2 outs, full count, bottom of the ninth, what am I going to do, what pitch am I going to throw? And I'd get to that point in the game and it would happen exactly the same way. And then I would do exactly what I planned, it would happen just the same. And I'd still be excited in the moment, like, wow, our mind really has that much control. And even after you release the ball, you can kind of guide it. And Michael Jordan would talk about releasing the ball and guiding it into the basket. And your mental state, whether you believe you're going to do it or not, just has a tremendous effect on the outcome. And so over time, I got really curious about what is it that our mind can really do, and all these kind of phenomena that can't really be explained scientifically, but we know intuitively are real. We have experiences with them. So I got more into Eastern philosophy, and I did Buddhist practices, and some Zen, and some Tai Chi, and did some yoga, and eventually worked my way over to Falun Dafa. And by now I was already in college. And Falun Dafa is from China. And I said, well, if I'm going to really learn this practice, I want to be able to read the literature in Chinese. And so I started learning Chinese and just fell in love with the language right away. You know, our class is like 8 a.m. and you know, most of the freshmen just show up late and groggy. I was there ready to go. It's my favorite part of the day. And I started learning Chinese history. That's what I majored in. And my senior year, there was a production of an earlier incarnation of this kind of New Year performance. This is 2005, and it was a Dragon Boat Festival, which is in May that year. And a friend of mine was running the production, and she said, you know, why don't you come host this? You know, you speak Chinese, it'll be fun. And at the time, I was really into writing about human rights in China.
Right, because the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners all these years. Right,
it was 6 years at that point. It's actually 20 now, and I don't know that I would have believed you at the time if you said this was going to last until 2019, 2020, or who knows how long. But at the time, we're talking about something that was similar to genocide, crimes against humanity, people being thrown into labor camps and tortured and killed for their beliefs, and later we discovered harvested for their organs, and just we don't know what the numbers are, but we're talking mass scale, and with the intent of eliminating a particular group. So it has a lot of those characteristics.
And so of course, this is part of why Shen Yun is targeted as well, right? I mean, I'm really glad that you talked about this a little bit.
Because, so skipping ahead to that, so Shen Yun, on stage, we have all kinds of stories. We have stories from Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a classic novel, or Journey to the West. We have ethnic and folk dances. We also have stories that take place in today's China, where we show Falun Gong practitioners happily meditating in a park, and they're being pounced on by thugs from the Communist Party representing the police there. And then there's this sort of battle that takes place between peacefulness and really a form of evil. And then you see how through their beliefs that there's more to life than meets the eye, there's even potential for miracles to take place, and for a sense that there's a bigger picture and greater forces at play. And so that's a piece where here we are performing through art the story of what's happening to Falun Gong in China today. This is a persecution campaign that has gone on for so long, and the Communist Party has tried everything to cover it up. The same kind of tactics that they try to use against us, they've been using for years to try to get Falun Gong practitioners to not be allowed in a parade, to not allow them to have an exhibit at the library, to not bring a resolution to town hall, these kinds of things. As well as, of course, just arresting and silencing anybody who speaks out about it, death threats to people here in the States, tapping phones, hacking emails. There's just a whole slew of things. And here we are, putting it right on stage, and people are talking about it, they get to know about it.
You know, something, Li Shai, that just struck me, I just came back from Hong Kong. We had a whole series of interviews there. I hope you I think you'll be very interested in some of them. I know our audience has responded incredibly well to them. Well, no, and you know, some of these scenes that I've seen that you're describing reminded me a little bit, you know, of what I was seeing when I was, you know, amidst, as the media guy with my yellow vest and everything, basically seeing how this police interaction with the protesters there, right? You know, you can be out peacefully protesting in the subway, like in Prince Edward Station, whatever, and police can come, and now we're seeing some evidence that these police here have been actually trained to some extent in mainland China and so forth, and just, you know, indiscriminately attack people. It just reminded me of one of the
mainland China directly.
Right, exactly. I don't know the exact evidence. There's maybe some, but but it's amazing. There's this kind of analogy that just jumped out in my mind as you mentioned.
Yeah, Hong Kong is a really interesting place, and I've been there, I think 6 or 7 times. Last time I tried to go, actually, I was blocked at the airport, not allowed in. I was on some kind of blacklist. I'm assuming all the Shenyun performers are blacklisted. But we were actually supposed to perform in Hong Kong a few years ago.
Right.
And we had 7 shows. They were all sold out. And I don't know if all the tickets were sold to people from Hong Kong or people from China were going to take a train over and watch it, but they were sold out. And we had our final rehearsal, a dress rehearsal, preparing for Hong Kong. What we did was we put together the best pieces from all the different years. It's a new performance every year. And it was an amazing performance. And we're on stage in costume and makeup, and the dancers are just still panting from the last dance. Curtain comes down, just an amazing rehearsal. We can't wait to go. We're 3 days away. And one of our administrative staff came up and said, you know, really sorry to tell you, the shows have been canceled. You can't go because they haven't issued you visas. You were supposed to get visas. A lot of people did, but the key members of a technical crew you have to run the performance were denied. So they kind of did it that way. And people had their bags packed. And so it's really a dream for a lot of our performers, especially ones who grew up, ethnic Chinese grew up outside of China, right, to bring this show back to China. And Hong Kong was like the first step in that direction. So this is still something we're waiting for.
And fundamentally, this is so interesting also because what comes through to me when I've seen the show is this kind of love of Chinese culture, love of China, you know, which is definitely the Chinese Communist Party's trying to paint a very different picture here, right?
Yeah, well, this is really what they're afraid of, because we all talk about Chinese civilization having 5,000 years of continuous history, and all the stories and legends have really been passed down one generation to the next. So when the Communist Party came over earlier last century, the first thing they had to do in order to bring in this import, which was, you know, Marxism, atheism, and communism from the Soviet, was remove what was there before. Because if you have a population that has very strong core values of integrity, and even a lot of the stories are about people in China in the past being willing to sacrifice their life and not go back on their word and not betray somebody, and that was really just a standard
got shivers
practice.
up my spine as you say that.
And being accountable to your ancestors, for example, to your parents who brought you up, to the emperor, all these different ideas of loyalty. And the Communist Party then wants them to believe what they're bringing in, which is saying there's no God, there is nothing beyond this. It's all about a struggle in a sort of natural selection sort of a way. And so the first thing they have them do is they kill off the people who had that education. They kill off the intellectuals, the people who have appreciation of history and literature. And then they have, in the, like the Cultural Revolution later on, they have children struggle, fight against their parents and against their teachers, breaking all of the previous ideals of respect, and really destroying the culture, not just the artifacts, smashing Confucian statues and temples and burning books and paintings, but also the spirit of it. Right. So that now you have 3, 4, 5 generations who grew up under this, and they don't really even know what the traditional culture was actually about. And so even when they learn history in school, they learn just kind of very, very broadly. A lot of the heroes from the past are now portrayed as villains. So you can imagine, like, if you're going to school in another country or here in the States, and George Washington and all our founding fathers are portrayed very, very negatively. And you know, maybe there's some trends in that direction too in some of the school systems. But in traditional Chinese culture, you really learn from the past. You learn from the ancestors, you learn from the heroes and the values that they left behind. And I think a lot of people now, if you have a story, for example, about Yue Fei, famous general from the Song dynasty, you learn about how amazing his martial arts skills were. But you don't learn about the spirit behind what he was doing, which was a sense of loyalty for the dynasty and self-sacrifice.
Amazing, actually. And, you know, speaking of self-sacrifice, actually, and I was thinking about how, as you were talking just now, how the NBA, for example, recently capitulated kind of instantly to, you know, Chinese Communist Party pressure, right, for the market. And I was thinking how, you know, obviously Shenyun, you know, it would be an impossibility for Shenyun to do such a thing, as there's this dream to actually, you know, bring this true Chinese culture back to China. It's like this thread of freedom, uncompromising freedom. I don't know. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, if you look at, it's easy for me as American-born Western to not be so affected by the pressure, but we have performers who have family members in China still. We had an erhu soloist, it's a musical soloist whose husband was jailed in China while she was performing with Shen Yun. My first MC partner, she was from Beijing, and her parents were still in Beijing, and she told me that her parents would sometimes get visits on a weekend, kind of weekly basis, every weekend, from the National Security Bureau. These are top people in the Chinese security apparatus, and they would say, you know, we know what your daughter is doing. She's performing with Shen, we don't like it. Find a way to get her to stop her, bring her back here, or you all are going to get in trouble.
Unbelievable. Or believable, but unbelievable.
Yeah, and it goes all the way to performers being blacklisted, and they can't go back and visit their family members, and people get married and get old and pass away, and they can't see any of this. And you know, it goes down all the way to very physical threats, slashing our tires. This is something we haven't gotten into, but there was a period when they would try to attack our vehicles. So we now have 24-hour security and surveillance of our vehicles, but there was one time when during a pre-trip inspection, our bus driver discovered a slash on the front tire of the bus. And it wasn't deflated, it was cut in such a way, he took this to the garage and they said, well, this is really interesting the way it was cut, because it was cut in such a way that when the tire inflates at high speed on a highway, it would blow up and you might lose control of the vehicle because of the way the tire was in the front. And the very next day we were on alert, so we started checking all our vehicles, and I discovered on our truck a similar cut. And then that night, as we're driving from Memphis to Little Rock, our bus had a flat tire. And this went on, and later they stopped tweaking with the tires. They started trying to do something with the fuel tanks, and they were putting corrosive material in vehicles and trying to do all these different things. There was even a police chase in Dallas where the guy abandoned his pickup truck and ran away. And obviously it's not going to be the Chinese ambassador doing these things. So we can't say, okay, this random person who was caught doing this is related. I think there are people definitely investigating that, but it's just sometimes a very physical threat, but it hasn't stopped anybody. Like we talked about, Shen Yun's just growing and growing, and we feel like it's a losing battle. And when stuff happens like with the NBA, to us it's really old news, but we're happy to see that more people are aware of it, because we've been aware of this from day one. This kind of thing has been happening behind the scenes, and there's a lot more that we don't even know about. And most of the time, really the vast majority of the time, especially here in the US, we find that theater managers, congressmen, whoever, they stand up for what we believe in, which is, part of it is, yeah, we will decide what is performed on stage or not, and not somebody in Beijing. But you know, there are some exceptions of people who capitulate to the pressure, and they'll take down their advertising, they'll take away their sponsorship, they won't go see the show, they'll cancel a contract. Very seldom in the US, but still every once in a while, more in some of these more corrupt countries.
Okay, Li Shai, so bottom line, someone might be interested in seeing Shen Yun. What are they going to see, and where can they see it?
Oh, they can see it everywhere. They can go to shenyun.com and find a city. We're, like I said, in about 200 cities around the world. But what they can expect to see is a celebration of traditional Chinese culture and stories and beautiful costumes and dance and captivating music. But I think they'll be surprised how it resonates in a deep place, in a way that they maybe were not expecting. A lot of people, I think, expect to see an interesting performance, a riveting or entertaining performance. They're not necessarily expecting to be moved, but I think that's what people often experience, and they come out uplifted.
Li Shai Lemish, such a pleasure to speak with you here.
Thank you very much.